Hello, very good morning. You're watching Sky News Breakfast. Just a reminder of your top stories now this morning. And a cold weather alert comes into effect from 9 a.m. as communities across England continue to grapple with severe flooding. The Metropolitan Police has confirmed that it's investigating potential fraud offences relating to the Post Office IT scandal, which saw the wrongful prosecution of hundreds of post submasters. And the cut to national insurance comes into force today, but the Chancellor has admitted that he doesn't know if taxes will drop more before the next election. So here now to review the newspapers are the broadcaster Esther Craku and the community editor and columnist at The National, Shona Craven. So very good morning to both of you. Lovely to see you both. Plenty of different stories around actually this morning, aren't there? So let's crack straight on and deal with some of them. And Shona, you picked out The Guardian's front page story, and this is something we've been covering widely over the last 24 hours or so, the flooding across England. And their headline says, Sunak asleep at the wheel. Who's saying that?
Well, unsurprisingly, it is Labour who are saying this. They are criticising the response to this pretty devastating flooding, with at least 1,000 properties flooded and entire villages cut off. Pretty desperate scenes. Of course, always very visual for newspapers. We have somebody giving someone a piggyback through the floods. I don't think there's a kayak inside, but there normally would be a kayak.
Sure,
there will be. I think there was online. So it's interesting. It's a it's a snappy statement, a snappy headline, but it's quite interesting to actually get into the detail of the story and see that Labour are saying, though, it's not about extra money. They're saying the criticism is that the money that they have in place for flooding is not being used in the right way. And of course, this ties in with Keir Starmer's hesitation to commit to any further spending given the state of the economy should he win the general election. But then, of course, when you hear from local authority voices, they are saying massive investment is required, given that this is not a one-off, that this is to do with climate change, and sadly, something we're only likely to see more of. So it does raise a lot of questions about how exactly this can be prevented. I mean, the weather can't be, but the response can be.
Well, yes, and Esther, for some of these communities, it's not the first time they've flooded, in recent times. Some of them have flooded several times in the last year.
Exactly.
And miserable scenes. When you see people's homes flooded, your heart goes out to them because it'll take a very long time to clear up, and the impact is enormous. So obviously questions are going to be asked of how you protect houses and whole areas and build up their flood defences.
Absolutely, and I think infrastructure is a big part of this conversation, and we talk about floods, but it's obviously linked to other things like sort of bin collection, which is a story that's been covered in the Eye as well, because now the logistical failures have started to mount up. So you have people not having their bins being collected. So
let's take a look at the Eye while you're talking about that.
They're facing rat infestations because they're having to not take their bins out because there's no one coming to collect them. You have residents in Nottingham saying that they're basically being faced with bin roulette because workers haven't been able to pick up their rubbish on scheduled days because of the flooding. They've been unable to get through, and obviously because of the holidays, the amount of rubbish that they have to have collected has mounted up. So obviously this is linked to the floods, and it's a whole kind of logistical nightmare that tends to mount up because of this.
Well, yes, and it's not just those sort of day-to-day issues that you want to work, like bin collection. It's also fairly basic things like transport as well is affected. It's everything. It's not just if your home is ruined or your business affected. It's also just getting from A to B.
Yeah, and I think, the headlines focus on, as I say, these pictures and these dramatic scenes, but actually it will fall away from the headlines that people will still be trying to dry out their properties. It's now going to be cold weather, which doesn't help either in terms of the recovery operations. So yeah, the knock-on impacts of all these things are huge. And of course, if your bin doesn't get collected one week, then it will be overflowing, and then the bin men will say, well, we can't do that, for justifiable health and safety reasons. So it's a pretty miserable picture overall.
It becomes a hygiene issue as well. And I think the bigger question is, why doesn't this country work when there are kind of more extreme weather events like extreme heat or high levels of rainfall and all of that? And that's the bigger issue here, is when there's something that is out of the norm, this country just ceases to function. And that cannot be the case because this is purportedly a developed country. This shouldn't be the state of affairs.
And the scientists say that extreme weather is going to become more frequent and more likely due to climate change in the future, which kind of links us on to the next story, doesn't it? This is the Daily Telegraph's front page, and they're focusing on Chris Skidmore, who's a former energy minister, resigning from the government over the issue of climate change and the government's approach to it.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see all these headlines in the round, because I think for so long, to a lot of people, climate change was a slightly abstract thing that was happening somewhere else, and then you see these categorical statements that is what's causing this flooding. So Chris Skidmore is actually resigning as an MP, stepping down as an MP as soon as possible, he says, and this is because he's a former energy minister, and he says he's having to resign because in that role he signed up to the net zero pledge for the UK, net zero by 2050, and so he says he can't in clear conscience continue to serve, as an MP. So
he's particularly upset about the commitments to more drilling in the North Sea.
Exactly. He sees that as incoherent and as contradictory. Obviously, we've seen a few rollbacks from Rishi Sunak, such as with regards to electric cars, but in particular, it is the licensing for oil and gas. Of course, his opponents and critics within the Tories are saying, oil and gas will still be needed, so do you want to import it? That is the argument. And also it's mentioned in this piece that colleagues have suggested he may have found a job linked to energy in the private sector. I mean, to be honest, anyone who's stepping down as an MP, is probably going to have looked for another job. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. But what's interesting politically is that, of course, this will mean a by-election, a symbolic by-election more than anything else, because actually the seat is going to be scrapped. So whoever...
Part of the redrawing of the boundaries.
Yes, the electoral boundaries. So whoever wins this by-election will be an MP for quite a short period of time, but of course the symbolism of potentially the Conservatives losing a by-election, it's not a tiny majority, but based on last year's by-elections, it could be an embarrassment for Rishi Sunak, so he may be glad that he's suggesting the election won't come until the second half of the year, and maybe the memory of this might fade.
It didn't go as well last year, did they? I think 5 out of 6, I think they lost.
I mean, it would be quite a remarkable thing to overturn a seat with a majority of 11,200 people. I mean, that really does indicate that the Tories are in trouble. But this feels like a debate that should have happened well over a decade ago, instead of when, energy bills are spiking and we're really drawing into question, the public, at least, the national attention is on our energy infrastructure and how we're going to effectively ensure the energy security of this country. I mean, you have MPs resigning now over, renewing oil and drill licenses and all of that. This should have been a conversation well over a decade ago when we weren't questioning actually how do we keep Britain safe from spikes in energy prices globally, and I think that's unfortunately that's the kind of the mechanism of how Westminster works. We don't really pay attention to it as a country until it really starts to hit our pockets.
Well, yes, and the government will insist that they will still meet their targets, and they talk about energy security and the issue of price, don't they, when they justify carrying on drilling in the North Seas. And when they talk about rowing back on some of these other issues like electric car commitments or boilers, for example, they say they're looking after individuals and they're concerned about the money in their pockets in a cost of living crisis.
Yeah, and I suspect if you sort of conduct focus groups and research on people in the public, they will say, we want to be net zero, we want to address climate change, but when you ask them, well, are you happy to pay for new heating or more expensive transport, then you probably get a bit of a mixed response. So I think these contradictions actually probably reflect parties constantly trying to please everyone, and I don't think they ever will. I think it'd be very difficult for either Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak to have a fully persuasive policy that the voters can get behind.
And then challenges for Labour as well, that have their big commitments for a new green energy system, and yet that will cost money, and Labour under pressure, something you referred to earlier, under pressure to not make too many spending commitments. They don't want to be seen as not being able to pay for them.
Absolutely, and that's something that's, I mean, clearly there's little wiggle room ideologically for either parties, because you're not going to convince anyone. If you can say that should we commit to net zero, fine, but are you willing to pay more for it? That's when the conversation becomes a lot more dicey. But again, I think this harks back to the fact that this should have been a conversation 10 years ago. This should be something in the national consciousness well over a decade ago, before we're now faced with the reality that actually net zero, the deadline is coming up. We have to make these hard choices now at a time when energy prices globally continue to rise.
More long-term thinking needed, perhaps.
Exactly, absolutely.
Take us inside The Guardian next. Esther, this is something you wanted to talk about, wasn't it? And we were talking about the prospect of another by-election, and this is throwing ahead to a general election when it happens.
The second half of the year.
Yeah, Rishi Sunak said he was working on the theory, was he? Is that how he put it? Something
working
like that.
assumption, yeah, that
Working
is
assumption
with the
was
second
in
half of the year.
his choice, so
Exactly. I don't know why he's saying working assumption like he's not choosing it, but okay.
But he's saying it's less likely to be in the spring, isn't he? But either way, this article is focusing on how reform could impact the Conservatives.
Yes. So reform has been hovering in national polling around between 6 and 11%. And I think the latest polling shows they've been consistently around 11%. But obviously, at the last general election, they didn't actually get any MPs into Westminster. I think the bigger argument here is how many disaffected Tory voters will likely accelerate the decline of the Tory party by moving reform. And this article particularly talks about how reform is less of a threat to Labour and Lib Dems because they're kind of the successor to the Brexit party, and more of those types of voters will be traditionally Tory voters as well. I do think it's interesting, though, because there is a point to be made about red wall voters that gave their votes to the Tories in 2019 that did vote for Brexit and do state issues like immigration and the economy as one of their main concerns. We still don't know where they're likely to go. Well, we know they'll be very disaffected, but will their natural political home be more of the Labour Party, which is looking a lot more like the Conservative Party these days, or will they also go reform? So I think the point here is not to write off reform because they could be a big threat. Obviously, in terms of the national consciousness, we still don't know very well where they stand on issues like housing and the economy and all of that, because they are a successor to the Brexit party, so their main focus has been on immigration and Brexit. But, where do they stand on criminal justice reform and all of these things? The public aren't really that familiar with, and so we have to wait and see. They're more likely to be a protest vote than anything else, but it's interesting to see how much they could accelerate the decline of the Conservative Party by splitting votes in key seats and effectively ushering a win for the Labour Party.
Yeah, because I think they said they'll contest every seat, haven't they?
Yeah, and that's the difference. That's the sort of argument that they represent a greater threat because, in the past, the Brexit Party didn't stand against sitting Tory MPs. I mean, it depends how tactical people want to be. Is this a protest vote or is this a serious attempt to get a reform MP in Parliament? I think that if you are right-wing, it doesn't actually really make any sense to vote for the Brexit Party if the alternative is potential. If you want to get a right-wing government, then you have to really vote for the Conservatives. And obviously, there are members within the Conservatives who probably fit more within reform. I think how far to the right can parties possibly go? As you say, already Labour have moved much further to the right than in recent years.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of gauging the national mood for actual real reform. If you think that so many people will be fed up enough to kind of see this shock victory for reform, like what happened with Donald Trump in 2016, you might be motivated to vote for them. But at the end of the day, we don't have those same political traditions as the US where, we would vote for someone of the likes of Donald Trump. That being said, though, Brexit was one of those kind of upset votes where nobody expected it, so it's not completely unlikely to happen. It's just very far-fetched.
Okay, well, Esther and Shona, thanks very much indeed. For now, you will both be back in the next couple of hours as well for another look at the papers, but for the moment, thanks very much indeed.